Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 2, Halacha 5. This is going to finish up Chapter 2. And in the Art Scroll, we're on 23a1. Chapter 2, Halacha 4 and Chapter 2, Halacha 5 are very much connected. And in fact, Rabbi Meir in this Mishnah is going to continue part of the issue from Chapter 2, Halacha 4, talking about how much quantity is going to be required for a retailer or a wholesaler before they have to start to worry about tithes. In Halacha 4, we got a generality, but now Rabbi Meir and the subject of this is going to get more specific into getting how much quantity is there before it has to be tithed by the seller, or alternately, if it's a very large quantity, it ends up getting tithed by the buyer. But how much is that going to be? And the Mishnah is going to go over that. So Mishnah starts off and it says, Rabbi Meir says, regarding that which is usually measured with small measure. So what does that mean? That means something like a bean. A bean is normally measured with a small measure. The Mishnah continues and says, but was in this case measured with a large measure. So normally you're buying beans, you're buying small quantities of beans individually. You're not buying these heaping amounts of beans, and when you're buying these heaping amounts, it's going to be measured with a large measure instead of the small measure. So the Mishnah continues and says the small measure is going to be subordinate to the large one. And what that means is basically that the buyer and not the seller is going to do the tithing. Why is that? The Rosh says, since the transaction is done with a large measure, even though it's involving beans and not wheat, it's going to be the buyer who is obligated to tithe. And this is because Rabbi Meir holds that we follow the actual and not the usual manner of the sale. So yes, the beans are normally done in a small measure, but in this particular case, it's a large transaction. And this large transaction is going to be with a large measure, and it means that most of the profit is going to be, or the benefit would be accrued to the buyer, and he's going to be subject to the Meiser Sheni tithe, not the seller. Now, we covered this before, Halacha 4, where it's going to be, well, what if you have a case where, normally when you're, the seller is normally selling small measures, and now he's doing a large transaction. Is that large transaction going to count or not? Is he going to have the chazakah of being like a small retailer? Rabbi Meir says no. You have to look at the individual transaction that's being done. The Mishnah continues and says, and regarding that which is usually measured with a large measure, but in this case was measured with a small measure, the large measure is subordinate to the small one. Again, Rabbi Meir holds that you have to look at the transaction that's actually taking place right now. And he's basically saying, fine, you have something that normally is done with a very large measure. Perhaps he's selling wheat, and in this case, somebody's buying some wheat with a small measure, so maybe he just wants some wheat for cracking so he can put it into a soup, and you don't need that much wheat for it. So this is going to be where it's going to be the small one, not the large one, and that means that it's going to be the seller, not the buyer, who's going to do the tithing. So when the seller is normally doing a transaction that's normally very large, but in this case, you look at the individual transaction, it's a small transaction with a small measure, then he's going to be responsible. The seller is going to be responsible for the tithing. Now, the Mishnah is going to define the amount of produce that's going to be considered a large measure. And we saw over as a theme in the sugya in Halacha 4, it's going to be where it's heaping. That's going to be where, on one measure, the small measure, it's going to be sort of leveled out. It's small enough that you can level it out in a container or whatever you're using as a measuring tool. And the large one is where you can't really measure it out and it ends up heaping. Mishnah now is going to define it, though, and it's going to say, what is a large measure? And it says for dry food, that's going to be a solid. It's going to be for 3 kabim, and a kav is the measure equaling to 24 eggs. So 3 kabim is going to be the volume of 72 eggs. And you can imagine with cartons of eggs how much that would come out to be. And the Mishnah continues and says, for liquids, it's going to be the value of a dinar. So it's going to be basically the amount of liquid that could be purchased for a dinar. Dinar is going to be a coin, a silver coin, that's going to come out, says the Rambam, to 96 grains of barley. And the Mishnah now is going to move to a case where the seller is exempt from tithing, even though he sells just a small amount. So Rabbi Yossi says regarding baskets of figs, baskets of grapes, and boxes of vegetables, as long as one sells them by estimate, he is exempt from the Demai tithing requirement. Why would that be? Well, if you're selling by estimate, it's usually going to work to the benefit of the buyer. And therefore, the seller already is not getting that much profit in the transaction, and most of the benefits going to the buyer, and therefore, say the Hachamim, that the seller is going to be exempt from tithing in it. And this, by the way, is going to be just like when he sells a large amount. Now, we were worried over in Halacha 4 about selling in large measure and small measure. And normally, children are going to be the issue here. Children can buy in small measure, but really don't have the economic means to buy in large measure. And so they were worried that it could be where children would buy the food, not tithe it, and end up eating it. And so you could end up looking at this as a similar sort of case where normally like for big baskets of figs or big baskets of grapes or big boxes of vegetables, that's also going to be a case where children normally they're priced out of the market, they normally can't afford it. And so while children might like grapes and figs, it's going to be the buyer that's responsible, because generally children can't buy these large quantities. And if it were going to be a very small quantity of figs, certainly it would be the seller who would have to tithe it. So the Gemara is going to define a large measure of solids. We've talked about this as the 3 kabin, which is going to be 72 eggs, a volume of 72 eggs. Again, 1 kav is going to be equal to 24. And the Gemara is also going to talk about the liquids as a dinar, and the Gemara is going to observe, and in the opinion of this Tana, this is going to be the Tana of the Mishnah, they gave a measure of volume for dry food being 3 kabin, but they did not give a measure for the volume of liquids. They gave the price of liquids being a dinar, but they did not give a price for dried food. What's going on here? That over here for liquids, we're dealing with just a price estimate. But why aren't we dealing with a price estimate for food? And moreover, we have a size estimate, a quantity estimate, a volume estimate for food. Why don't we have that same thing for liquid? Why is that? The Gemara is going to cite a Tana who's going to give the measure in the opposite manner. Rabbi Hia taught in the Brisa regarding liquids, a hin is a large measure. From a hin and below is a small measure. So a hin is going to be a liquid measured in volume. A hin, by the way, is going to equal out to be 3 kabim. And thus the measure of the volume of the Mishnah giving for dry food would be the same as a measure of volume that this brisa gives for liquids. So if you're taking the volume of 3 eggs, and you're taking 3 containers of the eggs, 72 eggs, total of 24 times 3, it's going to be 3 kavim. But a hin is going to be the liquid measure of volume. And in the Gemara, the kav is the volume measurement for a solid. However, they're both going to come up with the same volume. So basically, even though it doesn't say the volume measurement for the liquid, we know that it's going to be 3 kavim, and that is certainly quantifiable as 72 eggs, volume of 72 eggs. You can crack open 72 eggs and look and see what it is. And this is going to be the amount for the liquids. Now, in the times of, says the Rosh, in the times of the Tana of this Mishnah, there was a standard measure for solids, that's a kav, but at this time, there's no standard measurement for liquids. And so the Tana was thus compelled to measure liquids in terms of price. That's the commentary by the Rosh, but later on, there's a brisa that refers to this. They refer to a similar measure with liquids. Now, it's going to continue, and it's going to say, regarding solids, the volume of a limon is a small measure, and from the value of a limon and above is a large measure. Now, we are not talking about the yellow fruit. We're not talking about lemons. We're talking about a limon. And the Vilna Goan says the limon is the name of a coin. Now, this, by the way, is a coin that's referred to in Bavli Avodah Zarah 34b. And that, by the way, says the Rashi is the loma, which is the size of a zuz. And a zuz is a dinar. So they're using the Yerushalmi Aramaic here, and so it's saying a limon over here. But in the Bavli, it's referred to as a loma. But that comes out to be a zuz. So the Gemara notes that in the opinion of this Tana, this is going to be the Tana of the Brisa, they gave a measure for liquids, that's a hin, but they did not give a measure for dried food. And they gave a price for dried food, that's going to be the limon, not the lemon. And they did not give a price for liquids. So the Pnei Moshe says about this that in the times of the Tana of the Brisa, there was a standard measurement for liquids, that's going to be the hin, but no standard measurement for solids. And the Tana was forced to measure solids in terms of price. So the Brisa is measuring solids in terms of price, but is not measuring liquids in terms of price. So we have the opposite case here of the Mishnah. So the Gemara now is going to talk about an unrelated one from this Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak that it is the stipulation of the court that the expense of tithing Trumos Meiser is met from the funds of the seller. And the expense of tithing Meiser Sheni is to be met from the funds of the buyer. So the Pnei Moshe explains it like this. He's saying that the Gemara presently understands this court stipulation to have come with regards to Demai. And so it's going to go like this. Consider the case of someone who owns 100 kav of Demai produce, and in order to permit the produce, he has to remove 1 kav as Trumas Meiser, and 10 kav as Meiser Sheni after that. Now, this removal is going to be a loss, and the Truma Meiser has to be given to the Kohen. That's totally lost to him. The Meiser Sheni, though, can be eaten under certain circumstances and conditions, and it, by the way, is going to be reduced in value. It's partially lost to him. Why is it reduced in value? Because when he goes and redeems it, he has to add 1/5 to the value of it. So whatever he does, he ends up losing 1/5. He ends up having to add 25% to the value of whatever he did. There's a measure from within, without, So the total amount will be a fifth, but in actuality, you're adding 25% to the value of this. And Rabbi Yochanan is basically teaching that the court stipulated that this loss has to be shared, and that the buyer is going to bear, the seller is going to bear the loss of the Trumas Meiser. This, by the way, is a smaller tithe. And the buyer is going to bear the loss of the Meiser Sheni. This is the largest tithe, by the way, because again, part of this tithe, when you deconsecrate it onto money, you have to redeem it, and you're losing part of the value when you redeem it. So anyway, it's 10% of what's left over from the tithes, and then you're going to lose part of it as well. So the court is coming and saying that these expenses have to be split. And the Gemara is going to assume at this point that the court is talking about something with regards to Demai, and it's going to ask a question. It's going to say, with what case are we dealing with? If we're dealing with a case where you have a merchant who sells in small measure, then since the seller profits, the seller must separate all the tithes. And that is, he who will meet, all the expenses. And if we're dealing with a merchant who sells in a large measure, then since the buyer profits, the buyer must separate the tithes. So basically, either way, the entire tithing is either going to be by one of the parties, either the buyer or the seller. So what's going on where we have Rabbi Yochanan saying that there was a court that divided the expenses between both of these parties? And what's going on? So the answer, the Gemara is going to basically reject this original assumption, and Rabbi Bun Bar Chia says, this Gemara interpret the court stipulation as referring to where the seller told the buyer that he was selling from his own stock. In other words, he's selling from what grew. He farmed the stuff himself. He's not buying it and then reselling it where he never actually touched a farming tool. This is going to be a case where he's actually developing the produce himself. So over here, a large measure is going to be definite tevel. And since it's definite tevel, the seller must do the actual tithing. But the court here is stipulating that when definite tevel is sold in large measure, the expense of tithing is going to be divided by the seller and the buyer. So the Mara Fool is going to explain it like this. He's going to be saying that if someone who sells in large measure, by the way, only earning a small profit, he has to also meet the entire tithing process. And he might find, if he had to do the whole thing, he might find the burden too heavy and then refuse to tithe altogether, and that would leave it as definite tevel. So the court is stipulating that in such a case where the tithing expenses are going to be considered, that it should be divided between both parties, with the seller bearing the expense of the majority of the tithes and the buyer the expense of the Meiser Sheni. So, for example, if the parties agreed on a sale of 10 seah of produce for a dinar, the seller may include the Meiser Sheni as part of the 10 and give the buyer 9 seah of chulin and 1 seah of Meiser Sheni, or the equivalent value in chulin, which, by the way, would be less than a seah. So the Chazan Ish is going to explain this like this. He's going to say, although Rabbi Yochanan states that the seller meets the expense of the Trumas Meiser, he actually means that the seller meets the expense of the Truma and the Meiser Rishon as well, since definite tevel has to have all of the tithes removed before it's sold. You can't sell tevel. So Rabbi Yochanan is using the term Trumas Meiser merely for the sake of a parallelism with the Mishnah that we were talking about with regards to the baker. And there's two things about this. According to this answer, Rabbi Ban Bar Chia is saying that the sages are lenient with the seller regarding sales of large measures, and in two ways. One is, with regards to Demai, they ruled that the buyer must separate all the tithes, and that's going to be for a large measure. And in regard to definite tevel, like what we're dealing with here, where the guy grew it himself, they're ruling that even though the seller must separate all the tithes, he may separate the Meiser Sheni at the expense of the buyer. That's what this court is basically ruling. And again, I think what the court's worried about is that the farmers are just not going to tithe anything. That's really what they're worried about, and they're going to leave it as definite tevel. So there's another answer about this assumption. Rabbi Yossi says, you may even say that this court stipulation refers to where the produce being sold is not from the seller's own stock, which is, by the way, definite tevel, but rather from that which he bought from the Am Haaretz, which is going to be Demai. And the stipulation is going to refer to where one of the parties voluntarily says to the other, let us tithe the produce, let us rectify the produce. And then, nevertheless, the sages said to him, it is a stipulation of the court that the expense of tithing Trumas Meiser be met from the funds of the seller, and the expense of tithing the Trumas Meiser be from the funds of the seller, and the Meiser Sheni, which is going to be the last set of tithes, is going to be from the funds of the buyer. So, although the sages said that where the sale is a large measure, the buyer is going to separate the tithes, and where the sale is a small measure, the seller is going to separate the tithes. If the parties said to each other before a sale, let us tithe, the law is that they're going to share the burden of tithing. And without this teaching, it could be thought that in this case, the parties would share the expense of tithing equally, but that's not the case. The Trumas Meiser and the Truma Gedola and the Meiser Rishon are definitely going to be smaller than the Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni is going to be a bigger part of the total. So the Gemara is going to talk about the court stipulation similar to this one. And Rabbi Lazar says in the name of Rabbi Hoshaya, it is a stipulation of the court that the expense of removing the chaylev, these are going to be the forbidden fats, by the way, be met from the funds of the butcher. And the expense of removing the gid, hanasha, be met from the funds of the buyer. So both of these, by the way, have to be removed from the meat. These are Torah obligations. You can find that in Vayikra 7:23 and Bereshit 32:33. And the question, too, on butchering a cow is going to be, well, who bears the loss of these items? Is it going to be the buyer or is it going to be the seller? That's going to be the butcher. And so Rabbi Lazar is basically teaching that this court also stipulated that the loss between be divided equally between the butcher and the buyer, so that the butcher is going to bear the loss of these forbidden fats, and the buyer is going to bear the loss of the gid. He has to pay, basically he has to buy it despite it being prohibited. And as to why the court assigned the loss of the chaylev to the butcher and the gid to the buyer, not the other way around, that's a good question. So part of that is going to be where the butcher has to not charge for the chaylev, or he has to replace it with an equivalent weight of the permitted meat, and that is going to end up being a larger quantity than the gid. The gid is not. It's big. The amount of meat actually you end up losing can actually be larger than the amount of fat. So this ends up being consistent, where the buyer ends up, in a similar case like the Meiser Sheni, where the whole back quarter really can't be used, and that's going to be a larger amount than the amount lost by the forbidden fats around the kidneys. So the court basically is being consistent that the buyer is going to be bearing most of the burden, but not all of it. And these court rulings are necessary because you would have thought that they should just split it equally. That's not the case. The buyer is going to be bearing the burden. And the Gemara is going to finish up, and it's going to talk about a ruling from the Amorim about the court stipulation. Rabbi Abahu instituted in Caesarea that the expense of removing both the chalev and the gid hanasha be met from the funds of the buyer, so that the butchers will remove them properly. So this is probably a later enactment, and they were probably worried that the butchers were not being careful about it, and they instituted that the buyers be the one who bear the loss. And they were worried that maybe the butchers in this time were not being honest about removing the forbidden fats, and they have to be careful because the forbidden fats, if you eat them, you have karet. It's very serious. It's like eating tevel. And so in both cases, they're very much connected because the courts are worried that if you make it too onerous, the farmers with these large volumes are just not going to do any of the tithes. And again, this attests to the diminished status of the Jewish people religiously at this time. Normally, in an ideal world, it's going to be the farmer who separates out the tithes, but because they were so worried that the farmers were going to do nothing, and anyway they were unlearned, and they didn't understand the meaning of what it means not to tithe, then the idea is that they're facing a problem where if they don't split it up, maybe people are going to be buying definite tevel. And over here too, because now maybe the butchers were sort of cheating and at a lower spiritual state, they weren't going to be separating out the chalev properly and leaving part of the chalev in to sell it. And then what would end up happening is the buyer would end up eating the forbidden fats and getting death from heaven. So it's both like eating tevel or both eating like chalev. Very serious to do. So anyway, these courts are coming and really adding to the tradition and adding offense because again, these courts are looking at the practices of the people at the time in a diminished state and trying to make sure that they're keeping some of the Torah law and doing it in a way so that you're not harming your brothers. And it's very serious to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And if you're a butcher and you're trying to cheat on the meat and not cut out all the forbidden fats so you could sell it for a higher price and not bear that burden, you're really putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And the courts are trying to make sure that we have a way of peace and we're not putting stumbling blocks in front of a blind person. That's going to finish up chapter 2, halacha 5, and we're going to get into chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about feeding Demai to guests or poor workers and even to poor people. Have a great day.